Thanks so much. Good morning, or I guess almost good afternoon, everyone. I've been listening to a lot of these speeches, and I realize that everybody is telling you, you can change the world. Now, I'm wondering how many of you have this little message going on in your head saying, me? How am I going to do that? Is that something you're wondering about? The central problem that my organization, Human Rights Watch, faces is the problem of how to change the world. And we often take on the most difficult tasks. Our task is, how do you change the behavior of a dictator or a warlord on the other side of the world? It's not simple. But the method that we have figured out to do that, and we do it routinely, is a method that very much involves you and your peers around the world. And so I'd like to take my brief comments today to explain to you how we do that and how indeed you can personally make a difference. Now, most of us, when we think about enforcing our rights, we think about going to court. You hire a lawyer or some group and they go and sue whoever's violating your rights, and the court tells you that your rights are vindicated. The places where Human Rights Watch works, you can't go to court. The judges have been killed, they've been compromised, they've been corrupted. They won't stand up to the dictator. So we've had to come up with another way of enforcing rights, of getting dictators to behave better. The way we've done that, as Kate mentioned, we work in about 90 countries around the world. And in each of those countries, we have a young person, often like you, who is our local researcher. Their job is to conduct detailed investigations in those countries, speaking to the victims, speaking to the eyewitnesses, speaking to the government, and putting out an account of what human rights practices are at that moment. We publish a lot. We put out probably 3 big reports every week, another 15 shorter bulletins, and we use each of these documents, these accounts of repression, to put pressure on governments to change. Now, how do we do that? We do that because in today's world, nobody wants to be known as a human rights violator. Everybody tries to hide their human rights abuses. And so if we are able to shine a spotlight on their abuses, we can stigmatize them. And every dictator in the world hates that. They lose legitimacy, they lose prestige among their people, among their peers. They may lose out on a big aid package. They may lose out on a shipment of military aid. They may not get invited to the fancy summits where they get to drink champagne with the world's leaders. The various things that dictators want to legitimize themselves are at risk if their human rights abuses are exposed. But the key to that process is public disapproval. In other words, if we say dictator so-and-so is torturing his people, and everybody applauds, nice job, nothing happens. We don't accomplish a thing. But if we publish the latest atrocities and the world condemns them, that's when dictators begin to move. That's when they begin to improve their practices. And the key to that condemnation is public morality, public values, the inner beliefs about how a government should conduct itself, held by people like you around the world. Now, this is all very abstract. Let me give you a few examples of how this works. I think many of you are familiar with the problem of anti-personnel landmines. These are little bombs that are put in the ground, and they sit there until somebody steps on them, and they proceed to maim or kill that person. Now, landmines are a paradigmatic, indiscriminate weapon. It has no idea who is going to step on it. It is a dumb weapon. International law, the Geneva Conventions, prohibit militaries from using indiscriminate weapons. But do you think that made any difference to the governments of the world? Every government, including all of NATO, including the United States, had arsenals full of landmines that they routinely used. How did they square that with the law? They didn't bother. This was just the way things were done. This struck us as wrong at Human Rights Watch. When our researchers were out in war-torn countries, we would routinely see people, civilians, who had been maimed or killed by landmines. It could be a farmer working his fields. It could be a woman collecting firewood. It could be a child playing. These were nothing like the combatants, the soldiers that these landmines were ostensibly put in the ground to attack. And so we began putting out reports about this phenomenon. The press covered the problem of landmines. The public began to disapprove. Now, the major powers of the world hated this campaign. They had, arsenals, warehouses filled with landmines they had already invested in. They didn't want to have people tell them they couldn't use these. But we fought back. And through broad global public disapproval of this practice, we ended up getting a treaty banning landmines. Today, 160 governments around the world have ratified that treaty. Landmines are a dirty word. No modern military dares to use landmines. And indeed, this campaign won the Nobel Peace Prize for this effort. But the key to this was what people like you thought. Let me give another example. A decade ago, the problem of child soldiers was pervasive. You would look around the world, rebel groups, armies would recruit kids to fight their war. They liked kids because kids were malleable. They would do whatever they were told. They didn't have as great a sense of the dangers facing them. But of course, it was a disaster for the kids. They were pulled away from home. They didn't have an opportunity to be educated. Their lives were at risk. Kids were routinely killed. It was awful. But international law actually allowed this to happen. So long as you were over 14, international law said it was okay for you to be a soldier. So of course the armies of the world used child soldiers. Great deal. Again, as Human Rights Watch was operating in various war zones and seeing the disaster that the problem of child soldiers created, we decided we were going to do something about it. And we began publishing reports, getting the press to talk about it, building public disapproval, getting people to express their values to their governments, saying, we don't want you using child soldiers. And again, despite the opposition from the big powers, the result was another treaty, this time ratified by 150 governments around the world. And child soldiers, again, are something no one owns up to doing. A few countries, a few warlords still do it, but they're ashamed of it. It is something that no one approves of, and the law is now firmly against. So those are just two examples of how just the public, without any great arsenal at our disposal other than our disapproval, our sense of common morality, is able to change the way the governments of the world operate. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that this is still kind of difficult. I mean, can young people really topple governments? Can they really improve the way their governments behave? And I think, as you've heard, you're lucky to have lived through an era in which precisely that has happened over and over again. And that is the Arab Spring that you've been hearing about. Now, what is it about that Arab Spring that should speak to us? First, it was very much youth-led. And I think that was not an accident, because as people get older, they get more accepting of the status quo. And it took the youth of the Middle East and North Africa to say, we're not happy with the way things are, with the massive unemployment, the corruption, the stultifying authoritarian governance that was overseeing these countries. This is not the way we want to grow up. This is not the way we want to lead our lives. And so it was youth that took that first movement forward, that could envision an alternative status quo, that was not willing to accept that ugly reality. Second, as you've heard, they were aided by what you might call a young technology, social media. And social media was important because traditionally, a revolutionary movement had, a handful of leaders. And if a government wanted to quash that movement, it would target the leaders. And it was easy to figure out who they were. It was, it was the woman speaking to the crowd. It was the man who was publishing articles in the newspaper. The leaders were identifiable visible, and therefore arrestable. And classically, what governments did to stifle a revolutionary movement was to arrest the leaders. What social media made possible was, in essence, a leaderless revolution. Now, it wasn't completely leaderless. There were certainly people who were out front who were doing more than others. But everybody, by simply signing on to their Facebook or Twitter account and expressing their views about their society around them, was able to contribute to this gradual snowballing of a revolutionary phenomenon. And even when the question was, are you going to go out and take part in that demonstration? In the olden days, the only way to find out what was going on was to sort of go there, and you'd get arrested, because it would be just a few people who would dare show up. But what Facebook made possible was people could actually say, I intend to go to that demonstration. They could stand up and be counted without literally standing up. And then when 100,000 or 200,000 people said the same thing, people had a sense of safety in numbers. And a few of them, even if it was just 10%, did venture out, and quickly the crowds blossomed. So social media made it possible for each person to be a leader, each person to publish their views, each person to be an organizer or rallier. The government didn't know what to do with that. They tried cutting off the internet, but they discovered that their police need the internet not so much as everybody else. So suddenly, they didn't have a leader to arrest. They couldn't arrest everybody. And the movement was going, and the dictator was soon toppling. Now, the third element, though, I want to stress and close with this, because yes, youth were important. Yes, social media was important. But your values were essential. Because what the revolutions of the Arab Spring were really about were an assertion of values. They were young people just like you saying, this is not my government. This is not the way I want my society organized. I believe in something different, and I'm willing to work to make that happen. That is the power of our common morality, the power of just the personal sense of right and wrong that each of you has within you. It's that power that makes the work of Human Rights Watch possible. It's that power that makes it possible for you to change the world. And so I want you to think about those values, to nurture them, to build them, to speak about them, to organize about them, and to recognize that it is within your power to build a world that reflects your values. Thank you.
I think we thank Ken for his leadership in this incredible field.